So that was the books. Now let's look at the plot. And we're going to move really quickly. I'm going to try to keep myself from diving into the character development because that's what we're going to come back and look at the people in just a minute. So let's see the big picture of the plot. Remember, so we're on page 104. Look at the 100 or so year time period that we're talking about here. We're coming out of the downward spiral called the Book of Judges, and we're moving into the period of the United Kingdom of Israel. And our transition, and in fact, I just have you, if you're drawing on yours, just draw a little bridge from Judges all the way up to Kings, and the bridge is going to be Samuel. Samuel's going to be our transitional figure who helps take us from the kind of scattered mess that is the downward spiral Judges book and move us into uniting around what's especially going to be David. And Samuel's going to play a very important role. So, the key people, obviously, we've seen it, are these: Eli, Samuel, Saul, and David. And you can see that Eli functions as he's kind of like a judge. He's bringing wisdom to the people. He's kind of like a priest. And then Samuel will play the role of, he's sort of like a priest. He's ministering in the temple, the tabernacle space. He's sort of like a judge. He brings and dispenses justice. But he also will have this prophetic voice to the people. And we're going to spend a lot of time next class talking about what the prophets were and did. So remember, here's where we're coming out of: the period of the downward spiral, the darkness of spiraling in that sin cycle for about 250 years. That would wreak havoc on a nation. That's about the length of time America has been around when we're saying this right now. And imagine just a constant cycle of turmoil and invasion, and then victory, and then more invasion and victory. And all this is supposed to be centered around this God Yahweh, and some of the people are obeying him and a lot are not. You've got these other gods all around, and these other gods that people are worshiping, and it'd be very, very confusing, and thus the need for a king. And as we look at the plot, look at the bottom of page 104. What we find ourselves as we transition to the kingship is this: we're going to zero in that downward spiral. The book of 1 Samuel begins zeroing in on not just the nation anymore, but the leadership of the nation. And look at what it says. We have Eli, who is a priest in the tabernacle of Yahweh, and his sons are worthless men. It says they did not know Yahweh. Now turn to page 105 and let's see how bad things have gotten. Remember, we're zeroing in on one particular location, namely the tabernacle. How bad has our downward spiral got? Look at page 105. It says, Eli was old and he kept hearing all that his sons were doing in all of Israel. Here's how bad it's gotten. His sons are laying with the women who serve at the entrance of the tent of meeting. They're having sex with vulnerable women who are coming to worship Yahweh and give their offering to Yahweh. In our culture today, we're seeing occasion after occasion of powerful men using their power and authority to coerce and force women to sleep with them for their own personal gain. And we're seeing that, and we're rightly condemning that in our culture. It's a horrible, gross thing. And that's exactly what seems to be taking place here. We have these people of power. They are supposed to be serving Yahweh at the tabernacle, and instead they're using their power to get to force and coerce women to sleep with them. And Eli will approach them, but it seems as if his response is not strong enough. Notice what he says: "My sons, I've heard of what you're doing. It's not a good report that you're doing. I don't like." He doesn't seem to come all that strong against them. And notice their response. Of course, their response is, it says, they didn't listen. They would not listen. And we're going to see it's actually even worse, because look at the note that had come before this already in our story. In chapter 1, we're told this, that a particular woman had come to the tabernacle, and her name was Hannah. She's old and she's barren. In the ancient culture, to be a barren woman is essentially to be a sign that you're cursed by a deity, because having children is how you have protection in your old age. It's how you survive, and it's also your legacy. And here we have a barren, older woman, and she finds herself at the tabernacle in Shiloh. And Eli, who's the spiritual leader, one of the spiritual leaders of this messy nation, this messy group of tribes, he sees Hannah in the tabernacle. And here's how bad things have gotten. Hannah is there, and she's deeply distressed and praying to Yahweh. She's having a moment of honest prayer and confession to Yahweh, crying out to him and weeping bitterly. and she vows a vow to Yahweh. Here's what she says. She says, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant, see me in my distress, remember me and don't forget me, I will give my son to you as a servant. I'll give him to you all the days of his life. And she seems to make a Nazirite vow over her son. If you want to look that up, go to Numbers chapter 6 and you can see it. And what we're going to see is Eli is watching her pray. It's not printed here. And Eli sees genuine prayer in the around the tabernacle, and he's so confused by it, he assumes that she's drunk and he chastises her. This is how bad things are in Israel. The spiritual leader is chastising a broken woman for praying to Yahweh because he assumes that she must be drunk. That's how bad it is. Remember, we're transitioning out of our downward spiral. Yahweh is faithful, and Yahweh blesses Hannah with a son. And this has been a prayer that my wife and I prayed with our 3 kids. And so if you have kids out there, let me encourage you with this one day. I know many maybe watching this will have kids. And I love this posture of prayer with our kids. Look at Hannah's response. Oh my God, oh my Lord, as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who was standing here in your presence praying to you, Yahweh. She says, for this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition, my request. Therefore, I'm taking my hands off of him and I'm giving him to you. And Samuel will grow up in the tabernacle space, being trained by Eli. And we see that as he grows, Yahweh was with him. And none of his words fell to the ground. And this is where we get him established as, and you can underline it, a prophet of Yahweh. He speaks to the people, oftentimes giving genuine and harsh assessment of their spiritual state. That's the function of the prophet. They look at the violations of God's covenant and they call the people out on it. How would you like that for a job? And what we're going to see is Samuel is raised up as a prophet in Israel, and the people are going to come to Samuel as he grows in stature, grows in his prominence, and they're going to come to him and say, hey, Samuel, we want a king. We're at the bottom of page 105. They say, hey, by the way, as Samuel has grown up, he now has his own family, and we get this sad note. We're going to pick it back up when we look at the people later. They say, your sons don't walk in your ways. Same problem that Eli had. Now his disciple Samuel has the same problem. And they now say, appoint for us a king to judge, and underline it, it's really key, to judge us like all the other nations. God has pulled Israel to himself at Mount Sinai, sent them into this promised land where he has said, I will bless you and I will be with you. I will tabernacle with you so that the blessing of Yahweh might go out into the rest of the nations. I want you to look different and be different and act different. You're my covenant people so that you could bless the nations. I want to bless the world through you. And instead, look at what we have. We have the people of Israel saying, we want a king to be like the other nations. We don't want Yahweh. We want a king like the other nations. Turn the page. And what they do is they demand a king. And look at this is giving us insight into their motives. And I don't think it's good. I think we're going to see it as the story progresses. It's going to go poorly for them. Look at page 106. Samuel says, don't do this, don't do this. And look, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. And they said, no, there shall be a king over us, that we might be like the other nations. Here's what they want. They want a king that will judge and fight their battles. They want a powerful warrior king who will go out in front of their army and defeat all of their enemies. And here's the sad note. That's the very thing that Yahweh had already told them he would do. Remember all the way back to Deuteronomy 28 to 32. Trust me. If you trust me, it'll go well for you. If you trust me, I'll bless you and you'll take that blessing out into the nations. But instead, they say, no. All these other nations around us, all these other people groups, they've got their warrior kings who fight their battles for them. We don't want to trust you, Yahweh. We can't. How can we trust this invisible God, Yahweh? We want a king like the other nations. And God says something interesting. Look at the quote in 1 Samuel 8. God says, obey their voice. They want a king. They don't want me. Give them a king. Let them have one and let them go pick. And what happens is, and it's a very interesting part of the story, is Yahweh will direct Samuel to Saul, but it's exactly the person that the people would pick. I think we're getting a very ironic note in the biblical narrative. On 1 Samuel 9, we're on page 106, take a look at what happens. The day before Saul came, the Lord revealed to Samuel, tomorrow I'm going to show you the person that will be the king that they want. They want one like the other nations. Well, here he is. And it's not printed for you, but here's the description of Saul in the first part of 1 Samuel. It's in chapter 9, verse 2. He's a choice and handsome man, not a more handsome person than he among all Israel. From his shoulders and up, he was taller than any of the people. God says, you want a king like the other nations? I'll give you a king like the other nations. And the person that they choose is the one that all of us would choose, the most strong-looking one, the one who seems like he'd be the most successful in battle, the one who's the most handsome, the one who's the most prestigious. And isn't that how, even to this day, this is how humans often decide things. We look for the most popular, the most connected, the most wealthy, the most attractive, the most beautiful. We look for the one that has the best stuff. And oftentimes, their integrity and their trust in Yahweh is something that falls back to the back burner. As long as they have the connections, as long as they have the political influence, as long as they have the money, as long as they're pretty enough or attractive enough. And the Bible's going to give us a consistent note over and over and over again that is not what Yahweh looks at. That is not the way that Yahweh decides who is great or impressive or who he will work through. Oftentimes, what we see in the Bible, the biblical narrative will flip on its head every world system, and we're going to see that really on display when we get to Jesus, and especially think about his crucifixion. This is a sign of power for Rome and humiliation for Jesus. And what Paul says in Colossians 2 is Jesus flipped that. He disarmed their power and he triumphed over Rome. It's amazing the biblical narrative is going to do this over and over and over again. So I'm going to note it hopefully as we go. They anoint Saul as king, but then Saul's going to go crazy. In fact, many people reading it think he might struggle with some kind of mental disorder like schizophrenia or something. We see that Yahweh sends a distressing spirit on Saul, and we don't exactly know what that looks like. But look at what happens. Saul, the note that we get on letter E, Yahweh rejects Saul. Saul's going to do some crazy stuff we're going to see in the people in a minute. We're going to dive more into this. We're going to look at the plot now. God says, I've rejected Saul as my king. And as a result, he's going to direct Samuel to go and anoint the next king. And I love the story. Samuel goes to Jesse. Remember, Jesse has Ruth as his great-grandmother. The great-grandmother of Jesse is Ruth. And Samuel is directed to this man named Jesse. He's in Bethlehem, and we're on letter F on page 106. We see that Samuel is directed to go down and meet with Jesse. Yahweh sends him there. And then what's so fascinating is this. Samuel says, I'm supposed to anoint one of your sons as the next king. And here comes Jesse bringing all of his sons out, one after the other, the best, the oldest, the most impressive. And one by one, they come before Samuel. And Samuel goes, nope, not him, nope, not him, nope, not him. And then what happens is it's almost as if Jesse goes, well, I'm out. I don't have any more sons. And Samuel goes, no. I know that there's one more son here, and this is giving us indication that David is not well thought of. And he's either not legitimate in the family, or they've seen him as too young or not worthy enough. He's out tending the sheep in the fields. And Jesse goes, well, I've got David. And Samuel goes, call him in. And here we see the anointing of David as king. Verse 13 of chapter 16 of 1 Samuel. Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord, the Spirit of Yahweh, rushed upon David from that day forward, and Samuel rose. Now we have two kings. Saul is still alive, but now David has been anointed king by the powerful and mighty prophet Samuel. That's going to be a problem. It's already a problem. Like, think about in America, we have elections in November, but then the next president doesn't take his power until January. And that 3-month window can be a little bit awkward, especially if the parties are changing hands. If we had a Republican president and then the next one's going to be Democratic. And that can be a little bit awkward. Essentially, you almost have two presidents. We have the president and the president-elect. And there's a certain amount of respect that's supposed to happen in that 3-month window. Oftentimes, all the fighting that took place during the election is set aside, and they meet in the Oval Office, and they're very cordial. There's a certain decorum and respect that should take place because we're handing over power. But that's not how Saul does it. Saul is going to hear that David has been anointed, and he's going to lose it. Naturally, I think most of us, if you were in the position of power and you hear that your inner cabinet member, Samuel, the prophet, has gone and anointed somebody else, you're going to see that as an overthrow, as a mutiny of your power, especially if you are a power-hungry person. And so Saul is going to go crazy, and it's going to cause what we call strife. Oh, I'd say so. Strife between Saul and David on page 107. But notice the note that we've underlined for you, we've highlighted. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him and had departed from Saul. Just an interesting note. Saul knows it, that Yahweh's for him and against me. And as the story of Saul unravels, it's really tragic. It's pretty sad. It ends with him being wounded in battle and then taking his own life. The suicide of Saul is his demise. And now we have David as the king, this one that we will look at in a minute as the man after God's heart. And all the tribes at the bottom of page 107, they come to David and they make him king. And they say, the Lord said to you, you shall be shepherd or leader of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel. So the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron and King David and made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. He was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for a generation or for 40 years. And we're seeing here comes the true king that Yahweh wanted. Now look at page 108. We're going to get King David looking good. This is the first half of 2 Samuel. He captures Jerusalem, but at this moment they had yet to capture Jerusalem. He goes and captures Jerusalem and makes it the new capital for Israel. We're going to see he brings the ark down to Jerusalem. He receives this amazing covenant promise that we're going to look at next session. And he's generally going out in war to kind of finish the job that Israel had yet to do. He is fighting the enemies that are lingering in the land and driving them out. And for a lot of his life, that's going really well. And then it's all going to go haywire. And we're going to look at this in more detail in a minute, but the moment when things all go haywire is what we call the Bathsheba event, the Bathsheba affair. Remember the story. David his soldiers are away fighting battles, and he's in the security of the capital, and he looks over and he sees a woman bathing on a rooftop. And just like the story that we see with Eve in the garden, he saw, he took, and he consumed. He saw Bathsheba, he brought her into the palace, and then he had her. And that affair is going to lead to the unraveling for David of his integrity. He will then try to cover up the affair. That will then lead to him covering it up through having her husband murdered, essentially, on the battlefield. And it's all going to get exposed. And all of these events take place in 2 Samuel. You can see it there, chapters 11 through 13. He's going to get exposed publicly before the whole nation. And the rest of the story of David, he will never be the same. He will be a shell of his former self. And I'll just make the note for you and I right here. While there is forgiveness for our sin, and while we can trust that Yahweh has dealt with our sin in His own Son Jesus, conquering over it and substituting Himself in our place, and that's something that we can cling to. We don't have to walk in condemnation and shame. While that is true, it is possible for us to have defining moments where choices that we make have lingering consequences. I come from a home of divorce, and that divorce was the result of some unfaithfulness, and that has had lingering effects not only in my parents' life. Obviously, it led to the dissolving of their marriage. It's lingered into their subsequent marriages. It's something that haunts the story of my family, and it led for me to years and years and years of lots of sadness. I was 2 when this all went down, and so I can remember the first time not crying when I was separated from one of my parents on those weekend exchanges, and I was 13 years old. So 11 years of crying every other weekend. And I remember this, and there's moments in our life where we make decisions that have really lingering consequences. And while there is redemption and hope in Jesus, what we see with David is he will never be the same. And maybe this gives us a moment right here to pause and reflect, to look at our life, to celebrate the redemption that Jesus has offered, and to maybe assess, where are we currently compromising? Things of the world, where are we currently compromising with our integrity? Because we can make decisions, and I don't think people, it's not like people stumble into a really bad decision. Oftentimes it's small choices, small compromises over time that lead to the big failure. And so it's kind of a harsh, tough note right there, but it's important. And I think the biblical narrative is giving us this insight as we look at the story of David. And as David's life will begin to be a shell of itself, his son Solomon will be raised up to be the king who succeeds him. What's fascinating to me, Solomon is the son of Bathsheba. David has several wives, and he ends up having his son, through his biggest failure, become the one that Yahweh says that's going to be the next king. And I think that's such a gracious note of Yahweh, that Yahweh takes David's biggest blunder, his biggest mistake that defined him, and he redeems it to bring the next king. And we see the life of Solomon. We're going to look at it more in detail in a minute. The life of Solomon is the high water mark of the kingdom. This is where it essentially puts Israel on the map politically in the region. They are a respected nation under King Solomon. But what we're going to see is some of the same failures of his father David, Solomon will have. And at Solomon's death in 931 BC, the kingdom will be split in two. So that's the plot. From Eli and Samuel in this period of our downward spiral, look how bad things have gotten. Samuel will be raised up as a prophet and a priest and a judge, and he will be this kind of back behind the scenes worker with Saul and his kingdom, with David and his kingdom. Samuel will die. David will now have his rule and reign, and then his climactic affair with Bathsheba will lead to David's downward spiral, and then we're going to see his son Solomon take Israel and put it on the map. And some of the same issues that plagued his father will plague him. And now we'll pick up the people into our character study as we continue.